Hell yeah, I think this is a good one. I edited this down to 5 minutes, and then we show all raw footage after that. But we come up with some very good fundamentals of what R1 design should have. Hell yeah. Alright, hell yeah. So welcome back to another episode of Will It R1. And I think this one actually should be pretty sweet, because this is what all cataracts should have. It should be a double tube system, it shouldn't be single tubes, because you have no edging ability, you know what I mean? So now I can put leverage onto that outside tube, or I can transfer my leverage to kind of an offset midpoint. And that's what we're going to be experimenting. So hell yeah. Because a traditional inner tube, you know, if I show you that footage, does not work. Because this shows you how rotationally, it has no rotational drag. But hopefully this does. Booyah. Possible. So I'm going to draw, turn the boat. But even like right here, now I'm back to, you know what I mean, what traditionally works in R1. This actually really works is a forward stroke and a pry stroke. But this is where you want that balance. How having mass right here allows me and this mass to travel your direction. Do a paddle and pry and come your way. And from a stop, that's going to be the most powerful thing you can do R1ing. Even though a forward paddle stroke takes me this way, the draw is so superior that I can generate momentum. This really shows where the opposite is not true. Paddle towards you, sure I can turn, but I have no momentum, you know what I mean? And I can't draw through the boat. If I had to paddle the other way, but it shows you what the R1 stroke is. It's a paddle and a pry. And you build that based on rotational. Now this boat can be driven this way. Oh. What you can have in an R1 boat is an asymmetric design, because we've talked about sitting here to sitting here to sitting there, and that's the part I didn't catch. So let's go through that. I think a modification of a round boat and a paddle cat is what you want. I think you want 2 tubes like a paddle cat, and then a center tube, where if I'm in the center I'm lower, so I have rotational speed. And the most important thing about rotational speed is the pry. You want to be able to pry and rotate the boat. And that pry, you don't want to be prying off the back. You want an effective pry like just inches away from the center of the boat. I think that's hugely important to an R1 pry. Like just prying right here, it feels like I'm just prying where I'm sitting and I'm able to rotate the boat. And that's incredibly hard in a traditional paddle cat. And so that's one modification to the paddle cat. You have a lower structure with a floor that has a rocker design, and when you're on that, then these tubes are effectively out of the water. And then so when you go, and R1 boating has a bunch of balance points. One is kind of just neutral. And then from here, you know what I mean, this tube should be in the water. This tube should be either slightly out of the water or just fully out of the water. And just like this boat, I'm getting all my water contact surface from here. And then you should be able to have another secondary position where you can even build up inflated chambers that aren't into the water, but then when you do push them in, then that's going to build up that buoyancy. And then so I was talking about how, well, now when you do like put that onto edge, that could be your longest water line, either from a curved surface, like a round boat, functioning much like a snowboard, or it could be a straight tube where you do this, and now you're effectively turning that into a canoe with just a huge outrigger, where you can go straight, and you can do that harder turn. We were talking about how it's really hard to turn that way, because tracking in an R1 boat that's able to have minimal rotational drag, the hardest thing about it is to go this direction with tracking and to like brace it. where you can just pull yourself in the opposite direction using the draw. That's why R1 boating is very draw oriented. I would just say, big red flag, stay away, like, I mean, at your knowing the physics, do this side draw, just know the physics that your boat is dropping in and you're creating an eddy. Sorry about that. You're creating an eddy while pulling that boat. All right, and then the third thing that you can get is maybe you want to go onto this far edge and you actually wanted a longer surface, but two, a rockered surface, so where you're all the way out here and then you can really feel a boof. And in that boof, you want to be able to maybe shift your weight back, sure, but what you want out of that boof is when you're over onto this, it to feel stable and then be able to lift the front of your boat. So it's kind of like, if I do go out here, I think you want a rocker design that's asymmetric, and so like just leaning this far puts that boat way out in front. The front of the boat doesn't have to be too rockered, but much like a kayak, you want that back to be rockered, and then your front to be more in a lifting position. But hell yeah, so that brings up the idea that if you do have an asymmetric design, you can do two different things on both sides of the boat. You know, so when you turn the boat around, you know, it's the same. The back is now the front is now the back. But if we're talking about how in the center of the boat, it does one thing, you know, whether you're going the other direction. But if I'm on this neutral position, heck yeah, we get, you know, what I've been talking about. And then you get a third stability spot where you could use it for tracking or boofing. But if you can use this spot, if you can design it for one or the other, that means on the other side of the boat, if I design this side for boofing, then I could on the other side of the boat have a longer, straighter profile. And then when I flip this thing around, and then I got onto that same, I'm done falling in. Got onto that other side now, then this could be a longer tube, and when I get on this, maybe it's used for tracking. So then in an R1 boat, you're just like, oh hell yeah, we're going for this boof, I'm gonna get on this side. But those are the things. So the wildest thing about R1 boating is you have tons of dynamic options because you have so much boat to work with. And as long as you're not doing loops and play moves where your boat has to be like so difficult you can't even fit in it, hell yeah. You just have a lot of options on that. So anyway, all right, we're done for the evening, but I am gonna paddle around my offside. So let's do that. Hell yeah. Alright, hell yeah. So welcome back to another episode of Will It R1. And I think this one actually should be pretty sweet, because this is what all catarafts should have. It should be a double tube system, it shouldn't be single tubes, because you have no edging ability, you know what I mean? But a standard cat, you're going to be sitting in the middle. So booyah, let's just do a little walk around. Hell yeah. So now I can put leverage onto that outside tube, or I can transfer my leverage to kind of an offset midpoint. And that's what we're going to be experimenting. So hell yeah. Because a traditional inner tube, you know, if I show you that footage, does not work. But hopefully this does. Booyah. Alright, hell yeah. I just wanted to share some thoughts about R1 raft design. What I've noticed is that deflating a boat or inflating it to its tightest capacity, having a fully empty boat or a fully loaded boat, doesn't necessarily change the dynamics of the boat. So I think the key principles of an R1 or any boat is that as is, the design that is made has some sort of balance between rotational drag, like the ability to rotate the boat. And from an R1 perspective, that's a sweep stroke or a forward stroke. But the pry is dominant. If the pry can't turn that boat on the pry direction, the pry side, then it's very difficult to feel like you have a lot of control. With R1ing, positioning is superior to performance when it comes to paddle speed. But with the appropriate rocker, you can plane over the surface and generate decent amounts of paddle speed. But I just wanted to reiterate that, like, you know what I mean? Let's say a whitewater professional has their boat on the Stikine that's fairly loaded if they're doing kind of a 3-day trip or whatever, compared to just running a competition down the North Fork of the Payette. You know, I mean, just to use some stereotypical, what pros would run. The dynamics of their boat doesn't change. Sure, one's going to be a little bit harder, to paddle. Like, you'll have to up your game when it comes to a little bit of strength. But the ratios don't change. That's what I've noticed. Like, even on the Grand Canyon, when my boat was fully loaded, the ability to rotate it with prise was still there. Maybe it took a couple extra, but yeah. So what I've noticed a lot with longer boats, and it's the reason why you want, have a very long boat for whitewater, or it's just more difficult, is the ability for that boat to get offline and start tracking where you don't want it to go. So because R1 is so limited anyway with the paddle speed, being able to at least navigate and rotate your boat where it wants to go. So that was kind of my thoughts. I think I had some more, so we'll see if we add to this. Hell yeah. Now, this was the most important thing. So what I've come to realize with this video and with making R1 design videos, and my boat does have a little bit about this, is that when I go lean onto edge, it's I have a floor that is sticking out, like underneath the boat farther. So even if I'm centered in the boat, the side tubes aren't really digging in, and it really reduces surface tension. When I go onto the outer tube, it lifts the boat out of the water on the opposite side, and then it becomes an effective edge. But why I'm bringing this up is because I want 2 effective edges. My boat does not have 2 effective edges. It has, when I'm paddling in my paddle position, the other side is already elevated out of the water. But I've found that I need to lean more, especially when surfing, hitting big waves. I want to be able to lean, and a lot of my footage is me just jumping out of the boat because there's nothing else to lean into. So what I want is a design where I have another, whether you would call it like a third balance point. So one is neutral. The second edge is just a normal edging position while paddling. Now that has some variance when you lean into it, but I want a third effective edge. And here's the litmus test that I would say a quality third effective edge would be, is if I can have my feet braced and then just lean totally outside the boat and then do a brace. You know what I mean? Just do a classic, do they call it? Yeah, a classic high brace. The high brace is essentially a roll, if I'm getting my terminology right, where you're ducking your head into the water, you're bracing with your paddle, and your head is exiting last. So at least from the mechanics of an R1, because as R1 we don't have a roll, but we have the ability to tip, but I mean we don't have a brace either. You know what I mean? There's been a couple that I've seen of some of these athletes that are doing R1 that have achieved a brace, but I don't think it's a repeatable thing. It's because of the slope of the whitewater in that location. There was something to brace off of. You keep your boat upright. I have been in that, but as an R1er, there's so many opportunities where you're just like, shoot, do I bail so my boat at least doesn't tip upside down, or you know what I mean, or do I just ride it out and then my boat flip? But in that process, you're like, hell yeah, we need a brace. And it would have to come from boat design, having that third stability point. Just so if I'm totally leaned outside the boat, my boat is still catamaran the other direction. And so that is something I could practice. And then any of these things are something that you could practice while at a lake. I gotta check. I think I got stuff on the stove. Alright, hell yeah. So that's the take home for this video. You can lean out on a third effective edge, and because an R1 boat, because you only really paddle on one side, you could have an asymmetrical boat. So you have ability to design both sides differently. So one side could be an ability to track better
when you lean onto that edge, making it longer and straighter. The other could be an ability to boof. You know what I mean? And both could have, I mean, you could have second and third and fourth effective edges. It doesn't, you know, I think there is a lot of play here for the dynamics to shift just by shifting your leverage just a little bit. But for sure to be able to lean fully outside on one of those so you could do that high brace. So hell yeah, one for a boof, one for tracking, one for whatever the hell I was just talking about for the last 5 minutes. Bracing. Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. And I think any boat that has these aspects is fun to paddle in the lake. And I'm not going to just mention names, but I mean, yeah, there's plenty of boats that I hop in and I'm just like, cool, I'm sure it's going to be fun in rapids and stuff. But there is some magic here from my paddling ability, you know, to pick up a boat and be like, oh, hell yeah. No, we can do a lot with it. You know, even a whitewater kayak, you paddle a whitewater kayak around a lake, you can learn a ton. But with R1ing, it's different because some boats are just oversized, you know, for R1ing. And it just becomes a weightlifting. Cool, I'm going to go bench press around the lake for half hour. But it's really difficult to build skill. And then that's just one for this video, is like catarafts are designed for a paddler in the middle to have oars. And I've always thought, you know, in R1, what we've talked about R1ing can help the future of catarafts, because I think catarafting is still something at a high level. You want to ditch the oars and have effective edges and jump to the side. You can at least jump sideways, and sideways is where you're going to flip because you're going to purl your other tube so hard. So catarafting is an unstable balance point of like very efficient and very solid through whitewater. But the second that's sideways, you can be toast in some pretty stout holes, like pretty fast. And even more so than a raft because you have no surfability, no edgeability. And so hell yeah. So definitely R1 boating is a game of effective edge. And the fact that you can have your dynamics change so much just by shifting your body weight just a little bit. And now kind of the closer is why I made this video, is that rotational inertia of the boat kind of dictates whether it's going to feel like bench pressing. I mean, if your boat is so slow to rotate, every paddle stroke is going to feel like cement. And there's and in R1 boating, it's more changing your direction anyway. So it's like, change my direction. I want to go there. Use the river underneath the boat. It's a surfy sport. And so the second it's difficult to change direction, then it feels like, nah, I just don't think that's the aspect that you really want. I think you want at a high level an R1 boat. And, you know, this is just taking it down a specific way. Like, because I've also in this video said a log is going to be the best thing to get through the Stikine if you're R1ing. You know what I mean? Because you're going to get through holes, is dense boat theory. A log is going to go through, like even your PFD will have enough flotation that you might not get through. So hell yeah, you know what I mean? A log is a missile through the Stikine, and maybe you want that to a huge degree. You want, and even the ability to adjust an R1 boat to get like dense boat theory. And sorry for just stealing that term from someone who shared it to me, but I've always thought about it, and he just coined this term dense boat theory. So if he says stop calling it that. That's my term. Anyway, but hell yeah. So rotation, yes. If I hop in a boat and it's difficult to rotate, like I'm just like, okay, this is bench pressing and I can't learn much from a lake, or if I do, it's going to be hell exhausting. So there is that perfect, for me, there's that perfect balance point of like, hell yeah, we got tracking and we have rotation. And part of this video is like your driving stroke is a paddle and pry, and those are vectors. And that vector is going to be, you know, at 30 degrees to the direction, you know, a boat is designed. And so that is the third aspect of this, is an R1 boat should be asymmetrically designed at that appropriate angle. You know what I mean? It should be diamond shaped at a diagonal, or just have a diagonal line that's superior to the line of going straight. So hell yeah. All right, that's enough. Just that's what I wanted to share. So thanks for joining me. Booyah.
Right, hell yeah. So we're going to talk about what makes a boofable R1, because, this should be all you need to do in a raft. Maybe scoot, scoot up with your knees on the front thwart, or kind of lean back. Now you do probably have like 3 feet because you can extend your legs, but just with this little boat, I'm limited just from doing this and this. But the boof stroke should be leaning kind of on this back corner, and then being able to drive that weight up over the top, so you're getting all this glide. Because both aspects of being able to plow through, from the dense boat theory of having, momentum going into an eddy, and just like a chunk of water on the front of the boat. When I do like this back and then lean into an eddy, all my weight's in the back corner, and that's just going to keep me driving into that eddy. So that's one place where having the weight forward carries you. But then there's also just having the weight forward will bring you to a stop. It creates kind of a little eddy underneath the boat, where most all start from stop moves are really useful if you kind of have like a plane. So even just with this tube and then this plane, I'm able to, have a surface that's angled, that's kind of trying to crest up over your way. And so this is where like R1 boat design, because you're always like, especially for like class 5 scenarios, and like let's say you're on the Jacob's ladder and you're dropping over the big old pour over, and then you get caught in there. Well, you need to orient yourself and then work your way out of that eddy. And so all these class 5 R1 moves still have to be, textbook when having no momentum. And so if that's the case, then you want a nice glide surface when paddling. Now kayakers, they're just able to have that glide surface straight ahead. But with an R1er, your 2 strokes are forward drive and then a pry, and you can see that the pry is more strong. And so that really shows that you want the driving edge of an R1 boat, like almost the main leading edge. Because I'm just going to say, most of your class 5 moves are going to be started from stop. They're going to be, hey, I caught this sweet eddy, and now I'm going to paddle out into current. Once the current catches you, it does the rest. It doesn't matter whether you're paddling a log. But it's when you're stuck in very situational environments where you're in a class 5 eddy and you need to exit into the rapid. You want to have as much drive as possible. And this is your driving stroke, and then this is your driving stroke. And so I just think you want that going at that 35. So even if you're going to have an R1 boat that's asymmetric, that like if I'm going to paddle on my left side, I want that driving angle. The aerodynamics of the boat has to be at this 30-degree angle. And so like right now, I should be doing nothing except moving your way. So I think that's going to be the test, kind of the test tube for what's going to make a really good R1 boat. And I'm glad I'm making these videos, because I was shocked that I hopped in, that modified, just a modified paddle cat. But even if I have 2 cat tubes inflated, even chopped in half, it's just a lot of drag out there. And so what I found is it's not the fact that it's drag, it's the fact that it's rotational drag. So with R1, you want this sweet spot to be like, heck yeah, I want a turny boat because I'm always going to be oriented. And so this is where you get that kind of pry oriented. And this is where a lot of R1ers just are, hell yeah. I mean, I'm prying, and yes, prying this direction works really good. You know, if I want to go that way, I would say pry with a turn. You know what I mean? Like a pry is one thing. Pries actually are just building up water, and it's not super effective, but pry with a turn. See, I'm getting all that tangential velocity to actually work with me. So even in a boat like this, I can feel that tangential velocity and kind of work with it. And that's my only speed. Right now in this boat. But what I need is something counter to that, kind of some radial direction where I can get this tangential velocity up, but then I can make it come this way. So obviously this boat just needs to be longer. But underfoot, this has really interesting dynamics. All right, hell yeah. Alright, so when I go tippy and I'm actually trying to brace myself, that is actually pulling the boat. So that is something pretty cool. So let's try it. I'm going to tip and I'm going to try to brace the boat. Alright, hell yeah, and that pulls it your way. Alright, and so it's just kind of my personal comments, but this boat feels way better than a half a cataract with no rotation, with so much rotational drag. You know, from my boating, because my boat's always been tippy, and it has kind of these effective edges. but it makes it more tippy. But I'm always able to, you know, kind of turn it fast. And I'm just going to kind of reiterate that in big environments, I want the ability to be able to get my boat exactly where I want it to be. And then it's more like kayaking, you know, at a high level, where kayakers are developing those proprioceptive skills to be like, I know exactly where my boat is, what it's doing. And I think that's a bigger tool than just having, you know, something like the total opposite is a log. A log going through the river is probably the more superior craft, even in Class 5, because it's going to go through any sort of feature and really probably not even tip if you get it designed right. But that also has its disadvantage, because a log is only going to take one streamline down a river, where to get a log going laterally. And so that's where, you know, even if you look at what Class 5 kayaks do, they're able to move laterally, you know, mainly by being able to turn and then have some sort of driving force. So obviously turning's really important, but then also getting, you know, I mean, this is two turning, so getting your length and your ability to plane exactly where you want it. But you're going to reach a balance point, and that's the kind of the cool thing about this, is that there's going to be a balance point where you're just like, oh yeah, this, and that's, so yeah, the other thing this brings up is with R1 boating, and with the half of a paddle cat, if you get too much drag, especially rotational drag, every paddle stroke just feels like kind of like weightlifting. I'm just going to say awful. You know, you get into a boat and you're just like, ooh, like I'm sure I'm getting speed, but I want like proprioceptive like ability to be able to dial it in, you know, I mean, find this exact line. And that's where, like, I was trying to compare it to my Coleman canoe. Coleman canoe is real long. I can get the thing going, but it's almost impossible. Once it starts to turn, it's going to turn, and it's really impossible to be like, I want to go this way for a couple strokes, and then I want to turn this way for a couple strokes. And so that's kind of that balance point that I'm trying to figure out. And what a round, or just an R1 boat, doesn't even have to be a cataract. I think you can have crossover. I think a cat tube needs to have another tube out here, so and higher, just like this. So if this was your cat tube, you have another tube out here that you can lean on. Alright, hell yeah. So, yeah, cat tube. Another tube out here. So if this is my cat tube, and you know, I'm in a paddle cat, way out here, all this rotational drag, but then if I have this higher tube that I can get up on, just, because in a cat tube, leaning on your rounded tube doesn't do anything, hardly, you know what I mean? Where you need some sort of lever. The second you have this shape, that's why dories high side so well, because if you get the weight on here, this acts as a pivot and will leverage the other boat. When you have a round tube and you get over here, you're not really leveraging anything. So yes, it would be harder to paddle up over that other, you know, tube, but even in R1, if you're able to get up there and the other tube can actually be visibly out of the water, now your boat is going to be exactly like this. And then it's just a matter of how long do you want your tubes, you know? And you have the ability to have this tube out of the water to actually be taller and longer. And that's what I found with my boat. Because you have this rounded nature, when you put this tube onto edge, it's just like a snowboard where you're getting a longer effective edge. All right, hell yeah. I hope that recorded, so booyah. right, hell yeah. So I think tonight's video has just been a huge success and kind of what's going to be a good design for R1 boating. And these modifications can be made instantly to a paddle cat. So I'm going to try to take my paddle cat, honestly just strap this tube to it at a higher spot, and if I actually just put all my weight onto this tube, and this is the paddle cat over here, what's going to happen is this tube and then the main left tube of the paddle cat is going to touch the water, and that one's going to come out. And especially with R1 boats or paddle cats, that's actually one of the cool things about R1 boating, is because when you do lean, you reduce all this drag, and you still have this huge lever arm over here, and that's very useful because then you can go from your speed position and jump into the boat, you know, and plow through waves, or just jump anywhere you need to for that purpose. All right, hell yeah. Oh yeah, I'm gonna get a bag of water in here just to, because if I throw water in here, it's gonna build up that rotational drag. All right, I can already feel it, but I want to put that weight overhanging that tube. Okay, so this provides so much rotational drag. Just the fact that that much boat is displacing water over there. And so I think that's kind of what comes down to why cat rafting, or R1ing a paddle cat, you get so much rotational drag. You know what I mean? It might be efficient going this way, but when it comes to turning the boat, that's one thing where this is about the limit. This actually feels pretty good. Where, I mean now, and that's something that you really want to be able to dial in, because R1 rafting is like weightlifting. There's only so many paddle strokes you can do, to where it's fine if you're on a multi-day and your boat is just heavily loaded. Still, the rotational drag should be something you can control, where Yeah, so a little story. On the middle fork of the Salmon, last day, I found this huge tent that was fully saturated with water that was stuck in a rock in a corner. So I drug out the trash, maybe thought the tent was usable. It wasn't, but that last day I put that on this side of my boat, you know what I mean? Or maybe even just strapped to that left tube just so I could have my feet in that compartment. However, it provided so much drag that it was absolutely brutal exiting that day. And just the whole mechanics of the boat just went from, you know, feeling magical to just awful. And those are on multi-days where you're fully loaded, but that rotational drag is, oh heck yeah, well there you go. It kind of saves the day. You do have a little bit of juice over there. Alright, hell yeah. So let's paddle this thing around because this thing is just right about perfect. But still, it's even just a little heavier. And that's no more than like 15 pounds of water. Alright, heck yeah, counterbalancing, having a counterbalance of weight right in that corner, that really helps. Because now I'm almost able to do that boof stroke where I can lean back and then paddle up and over that. Let's get another strap on this. I think this actually really works, and because now so like what I was, how do I phrase this? Like what I think what feels good in an R1 boat is a paddle stroke where you have that balance of rotational drag. If that rotational drag is too much, I'm gonna be like, and that's why even paddling my boat on the Grand Canyon, let's say it had 200 pounds, it still was dynamically the same. And guaranteed, hell yeah. So I lost all that footage. Or I mean just all the good parts. But what we're going to talk about is how having mass right here allows me and this mass to travel your direction. So even just having this mass, I'm able to do a paddle and pry and come your way. And from a stop, that's going to be the most powerful thing you can do R1ing. And so I'm going to go back and forth and we're going to show that. And if this boat had aerodynamics, you know, out front, once you get up to speed, you'd be able to use those. Alright, so, but from a dead stop, this pry is going to take me that way. And that's the strongest paddle stroke I have. Once I get this momentum, I can turn the boat. So if you're ever stopped or going low momentum, you'll probably have to paddle at this, 30-degree angle, get that momentum, and then start driving forward. Alright, so I was mentioning probably the biggest improvements is if this is a paddle cat, where you have two cat tubes right here, you for sure want this tube so you can get that other one out of the water. And then with the let's see. Alright, hell yeah. And so one of the things that you can do is to have this tube be your longest tube. So when you're off of this tube, that's out of the water, and then when you're onto this tube, that's going to be your longest effective edge. So very much like a snowboard, like that has a lot of rocker, when you put that onto edge, that is going to be your railed edge. And that way, once you're onto that edge, then you're able to paddle straight and even the harder direction. So I'm gonna go back and forth showing that paddling this way is the harder direction. Or I'll just do that from here. So paddling towards that way is the harder direction because I'm not getting a lot of tracking. Because the boat in essence is pretty rotationally kind of dynamic. So if I was to, get up onto an edge that was a longer tube, then it almost acts like a canoe, and that's kind of the direction we're going. And I was saying how that's a benefit to paddle cats, just in general, is when you do paddle, those tubes are going to be, going in the direction, you're going to be tracking really good. And so even though it takes a lot of muscle sometimes to paddle those paddle cats, you're building momentum and you're keeping those directions. And it's actually kind of easy to go the harder direction because if you paddle this way, you can easily brace that angle. What I have found in paddle cats, it's hard to sweep just from a pry. Like this is basically how much you'd want to turn your boat every pry. But the other thing with those paddle cats is sometimes when they lock in and start to pull, it's really hard to slow that down. And so if it does pull that direction, like I said, it's really hard to pry a paddle cat back around. And so that brings up kind of the levels of what an R1 paddle cat should be. You should be able to have your two outer tubes should be up out of the water, and then your middle part should be lower down and should be rotationally fast. And so if you put all your weight in the middle of that paddle cat, you should be able to rotate very easily And then when applying weight to one of those tubes, that's where you should have 2 tubes in the water. You know what I mean? And you can modify that height so it's not too extreme, but when you do lean onto this tube, you want that other tube to be out of the water, and you want the contact point to be really close, these 2 tubes, almost like you're just in an IK with a counter lever. And that's where, once you are onto this tube, you know what I mean, then it doesn't, well, it should have 2 locations. It should have kind of just where you're normally natural, and you still should be able to have rotation, you know, not a lot of rotational drag, especially on the pry. Being able to pry this direction, no matter what, that should be the limiting factor. Like when I get into a boat and just sitting in my normal position, if I can't, you know what I mean, that's going to be the trade-off. If, you know, if you can't pry that direction very well. But it would be superior is if just in your normal spot, you could pry this much, but then in this outriggered spot, you know, when you get to a second balance point, and look at this, you know what I mean? Like I'm moving from here to here, but sky's the limit. You can build up. Alright, hell yeah. So I guess I have my GoPro on because that's catching everything. But that on my DSLR, it's not catching a darn thing. But it gets me thinking though. So what you can have in an R1 boat is an asymmetric design, because we've talked about sitting here to sitting here to sitting there, and that's the part I didn't catch. So let's go through that. I think a modification of a round boat and a paddle cat is what you want. I think you want 2 tubes like a paddle cat, and then a center tube, where if I'm in the center I'm lower, so I have rotational speed. And the most important thing about rotational speed is the pry. You want to be able to pry and rotate the boat. And that pry, you don't want to be prying off the bat. You want an effective pry like just inches away from the center of the boat. I think that's hugely important to an R1 pry. Like just prying right here, it feels like I'm just prying where I'm sitting and I'm able to rotate the boat. And that's incredibly hard in a traditional paddle cat. And so that's one modification to the paddle cat. You have a lower structure with a floor that has a rocker design, and when you're on that, then these tubes are effectively out of the water. And then so when you go, and R1 boating has a bunch of balance points. One is kind of just neutral. And then from here, you know what I mean, this tube should be in the water. This tube should be either slightly out of the water or just fully out of the water. And just like this boat, I'm getting all my water contact surface from here. And then you should be able to have another secondary position where you can even build up inflated chambers that aren't into the water, but then when you do push them in, then that's going to build up that buoyancy. And then so I was talking about how, well, now when you do like put that onto edge, that could be your longest water line, either from a curved surface, like a round boat, functioning much like a snowboard, or it could be a straight tube where you do this and now you're effectively turning that into a canoe with just a huge outrigger where you can go straight and you can do that harder turn. We were talking about how it's really hard to turn that way because tracking in an R1 boat that's able to have minimal rotational drag, the hardest thing about it is to go this direction with tracking and to like brace it, where you can just pull yourself in the opposite direction using the draw. That's why R1 boating is very draw oriented. I would just say, big red flag, stay away, like, I mean, at your knowing the physics, do this side draw, just know the physics that your boat is dropping in and you're creating an eddy. Sorry about that. You're creating an eddy while pulling that boat. All right. And then the third thing that you can get is maybe you want to go onto this far edge and you actually wanted a longer surface, but two, a rockered surface. So where you're all the way out here and then you can really feel a boof. And in that boof, you want to be able to maybe shift your weight back, sure, but what you want out of that boof is when you're over onto this, it to feel stable and then be able to lift the front of your boat. So it's kind of like, if I do go out here, I think you want a rocker design that's asymmetric, and so like just leaning this far puts that boat way out in front. The front of the boat doesn't have to be too rockered, but much like a kayak, you want that back to be rockered, and then your front to be more in a lifting position. But hell yeah, so that brings up the idea that if you do have an asymmetric design, you can do two different things on both sides of the boat. You know, so when you turn the boat around, you know, it's the same. The back is now the front is now the back. But if we're talking about how in the center of the boat, it does one thing, that, you know, whether you're going the other direction. But if I'm on this neutral position, heck yeah, we get, you know, what I've been talking about. And then you get a third stability spot where you could use it for tracking or boofing. But if you can use this spot, if you can design it for one or the other, that means on the other side of the boat, if I design this side for boofing, then I could on the other side of the boat have a longer, straighter profile. And then when I flip this thing around, and then I got onto that same, I'm done falling in. Got onto that other side now, then this could be a longer tube, and when I get on this, maybe it's used for tracking. So then in an R1 boat, you're just like, oh hell yeah, we're going for this boof, I'm gonna get on this side. So those are the things. So the wildest thing about R1 boating is you have tons of dynamic options because you have so much boat to work with. And as long as you're not doing loops and play moves where your boat has to be like so difficult you can't even fit in it, hell yeah. You just have a lot of options on it. So anyway, all right, we're done for the evening, but I am gonna paddle around my offside. So let's do that. Hell yeah. Oh, this is wild because I'm so used to paddling on this offside that I just naturally know where to sit. And mainly R1 boating is getting this thigh dialed in. It's like a plank of wood, you know what I mean, just like right here. And it's what I found, it's not a pivot. It's not a pivot point on your hip. It's using this part of your leg to actually plank wood. You know what I mean? So you have like a flat surface. So yeah, so I'm just gonna figure out what I'm doing here. And it's so fat. I love doing offside because it's just whatever I'm doing here just feels like total garbage over here. It's like my whole body just isn't designed. And so what I talk about is if you're getting good on something R1, you know, mimic the exact position. Like I can barely put my feet into that exact position. And so this is stuff that, hell yeah, I can come out here every night and work on this. Because like right now, if I feel like totally unstable, why would I, that limits your ability to run harder rivers if I have to do it from this really precarious spot. where if I just switch onto my strong side. So that's one thing that I talked about. Notice what's going on. I have this leg just a little bit lower. I feel all the weight in it. This one's out here onto this tube. This one's kind of diving in at a point. So let's mimic that. I'm gonna put this here, drive this knee lower. I can feel that, I guess. This thing's getting in the way. And then I'm gonna point my toe. So even just right there, I feel worlds more balanced. And so that's a tutorial in itself. If you feel like something is going good on your offside R1ing, it's usually due to body position. And so try to mimic it. Look exactly where your body is, feet and everything, and then mimic it. And even on this leg, what I've noticed, I'm not just on a one pivot of the hip. I'm really using this thigh as a counter balance. Hell yeah. And driving it in, and that's allowed me to brace off something. See, look at this. Like right now I'm just feeling that. Driving this thigh in, I'm able to really lean forward and just have so much more brace. And all this is bringing me back into the boat. So paddling still feels awful, but hell yeah, let's do it. And then don't fight the dynamics, you know what I mean? If a strong pry and a paddle stroke is what I need, I don't really need to throw my whole body into it. I just need to do smart paddle strokes. So on the offside, I consider it, the analogy is ping pong. If you've ever played ping pong on your left side, sometimes you can be a lot better because you're not aggressive. But you really have to focus on okay, hit the ball over the net. So we're going to do that. I'm going to drive that way, and we've talked about it, pry-oriented. So I need to pry-orient, short strokes. See, and I call this the Jedi. It's like once you figure this is strong side, and I just know what the boat is doing. So I'm gonna do it one more time. I'm gonna switch to my offside. And maybe just kind of go slower. But when the boat messes up though, like right here, it feels like it messed up. Do those sweeping turns and see if you can dial it in. So this stroke is messing me up. I'm already messed up. So I need to start from this location and then just feel the direction the boat's going. It always has to be corrected, but now I'm going that way. So I can do the same thing any direction I want as long as I'm just paying attention to what direction the boat's going. So every stroke has to be balanced. See, I thought I was going to come towards you, but I went that direction. And so that also, from a tutorial perspective, is almost like close your eyes to be like, okay, I know that the boat is going to be balanced paddle and pry. And then whatever direction it's going is the direction it's going. You know what I mean? So let's see if I can actually dial that in to go to you towards the camera. I know where the camera is. I'm going to feel where the boat's going when I do this. Okay, and then I'm going to modify a little bit. So to get towards you, I need to be facing this direction. And that's the Jedi, you know what I mean? Where I think you can just lose so much mileage is if you're not paying attention to that. If you're trying to force, be like, no, like when I paddle towards you, I want to be this direction. We'll get out of town, your boat's literally going 90 degrees, especially this thing. This thing is going 90 degrees to that. If I want to paddle towards you in this boat, I literally have to be right in here. And now I feel that. And I consider that kind of the Jedi. Alright, we're probably losing all sorts of light, I'll tell you. Alright, hell yeah, I think we got comfortable. Booyah. Alright, thanks for joining me. That's going to be a video. Alright, hell yeah, with the last of our juice. I'm just gonna show you that if you had to R1 this, I think it's literally impossible. You know what I mean? It doesn't have any counter lever. And this, well, I should put that bag of water. If you had that bag of water, that would provide the counter lever. Because this shows you how rotationally, it has no rotational drag. So literally the only way to get towards you is to, I'm doing that paddle pry, but it's got so much rotational drag that that's almost impossible. So if I had to paddle the other way. And it shows you what the R1 stroke is. It's a paddle and a pry. And you build that based on rotational. Now this boat can be driven this way. Oh. Oh, that sucks. Oh, I hit a rock. That's so interesting. So next time I'm at the surf waves, I'm actually gonna start wearing a back brace, because that is one of the injuries you can get R1 boating so easily, is landing on your back into rocks. Now with the life jacket, that does provide a little bit of protection, but I've hit my lower hips and stuff. All right, hell yeah. So this draw stroke is the only juice that you have. But again, drawing the boat, what happens is you're lowering this tube and it's sucking down. So it's not the most efficient way. Let me get this bag of water on with the rest of our light. Hardly have any light left, it's all right. Hell yeah, got a substantial amount of water. shoot. I'm probably don't have enough light for this. I need to get that water. I need to get this water right here. So I think I have too much water. Or this one. Hell yeah. Well, black one. Right, hell yeah. So hopefully we can get that to chill out right there. I think we can. All right, let's see if you can get an inner tube to R1. You know, I'll probably try to. If this goes, I'll make this video for in the light. All right, hell yeah. Now you can use that, like that actually balances it out. So when I do come towards you, we talked about how that is a line of mass. Like I can get that line of mass to come towards your direction. It's not staying where I want it. Alright, so the principles are there. Because we have a line of mass, that is the line that wants to, if I put a driving force behind it, it builds up some plow, you know, kind of plows through. But this thing has too much, it has zero rotational drag. And so the pry is just too easy. Well, actually, and even the pry actually doesn't even have anything to pry against. So let's see if, yeah, the pry right now actually feels harder than it should. This is real interesting because the drag on here feels way more, I mean the rotational drag, I filled that water up real good, and the rotational drag is, it's unstable, where it takes a lot of effort to start that rotational drag, but once it does, there's nothing to stop it. There's no part of the boat that's dynamic to cause a glide. All right, we'll go back and forth, and that's probably a video.